Oh, hi folks, good evening. Hope you're well. Monday evening. Well. Um, I'm not a great historian. In fact, as a child, I used to despise being taught history at school. I could never see the point. What's done is done. It's the future that matters. But what I soon realized in my life as I grow older is that those who don't know history are destined to repeat the mistakes that happened within history. That's the sum of it. If we don't learn by our mistakes, we're going to make them again and again and again, and I think that is so true. So it's very important that we know history, or smatterings of it, because they do say that history is history is recorded by the victors. Oh, how true. Because the real truth will set us free, and that has been suppressed, of course, by those in the know. Sorry, my eyes are watering in this video simply because I get hay fever. So, with that said, I'm going to tell you a little story, interspersed maybe with a little story that you can tell your children. Well, I'll tell you the first little story, the first little maxim, if you like, of my videos are usually about human beings and our stupidity in interaction and social intercourse, avoiding the conversation about sex, of course, because it's a family show, but just social intercourse on this occasion, folks, sorry to say. But just something about human nature. We are ultimately, when it comes down to it, selfish. There's no finer way to put that. No more. It's not. It's probably the most honest thing you'll hear people say. Is that we are all ultimately selfish. Down to our dying breath, we are selfish. There was a great flood in the world of wildlife one day. The rain was torrential, and the rivers were flowing fast, and what was semi-desert suddenly became a torrent of liquid mud pouring down the sides of the rivers, much to the surprise of the local scorpions. If you've heard this before, please forgive me, it bears repeating for those who don't know it. And the scorpion's thinking, oh crap, I'm going to drown. I need to get across the river to the drier side of the bank before I drown, as he flips his little flippers. And he looks for help, and he sees a frog, usually his prey. And he thinks, frogs can swim, maybe I'll hitch a ride on the back of the frog. So he confronts this frog. And he says, listen, frog, I know, don't, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to kill you, for goodness sake. Now, in return for not killing you, I want you to give me a lift. I'll get on your back and you give me a little swim lift over to the other side. I'll hop off the bank and we'll both go our own ways. And I promise not to sting you. And the frog said, I've heard it all before. I don't trust you. Oh, come on, look, if I sting you, you'll drown and I'll drown. We'll both go down. Don't be so stupid. I don't want to commit suicide quite yet. So the frog said, well, on this occasion, I'll trust you. Hop on the back. So the scorpion gets on the back of the frog. And they proceed, as the frog does, to swim across against the torrent of the river towards the other side. The frog's still waiting for the sting, and it hasn't happened. He's actually getting ever hopeful that the scorpion will live up to its promise. After all, it made sense that if the scorpion killed the frog, they would both die. And the frog was sure that the scorpion wasn't suicidal. Anyways, the frog went near the bank and just about to lean up and get hold of the bank to crawl out, pulling the scorpion with him. The frog felt this terrible sting right in the back of his neck. I thought, I can't believe it, he stung me. Or words to that effect. And the frog said to the scorpion, "You fool, now we are both going to die, me and you. Why did you do it? Why did you sting us, knowing it was both for our certain death?" And the scorpion said, "I have no idea, except that it is in my nature. It's in the frog's nature. Sorry, it's in the scorpion's nature. That's all." And that is oh so true. That deep down, we are savage beasts in many ways, human beings. We have an affinity for self-service. And one thing we cannot disguise is our nature. Now, there is an argument about nurture and nature. But I think we are born with a set of values, that's for sure, that we inherit. Whether it be in our genes or not, it's somewhere in us. That for the most part, human beings are not born sinners. We learn to do horrible things. We certainly witness them, and what we witness as a result of these horrible things happening and how they are dealt with is what we learn from. And some of these things are abhorrent, of course. Now I want you to remember that it's in their nature. Okay, just remember that. We are surrounded, folks, surrounded by scorpions who say one thing and do another. They can't contain themselves. They cannot forgive them, Father, for they don't know and cannot control themselves. It is in their nature. Whether it be a lie, a sting, or some other action, it is in their nature. That's all. There was a time, certainly in battles historically and in political battles as well, but if we look back in the times of Alexander the Great, one of the greatest head honchos, he was astonishing in the speed in which he got rid of his enemies, and his smaller army was continually winning over bigger armies because of his skills. He was an amazing tactician, and you can read about him yourself. But there was he was struggling at one stage, and he did have quite an army still, but he didn't want to sort of have any more battles. But he come across this the Gordians, and I hope I'm saying this right, but I hope you'll get the gist. He come across this bastion of a fort. It was in a fantastic strategic position. The Gordians had held it, and they'd never been defeated, yada yada yada, because they were in such a fantastic strategic position, overlooking the entire region. And Alexander was rather keen to take it. But his troops, he knew that his troops they were battle fatigued. They'd been fighting all this time, and they got to the main gates of the Gordians' defensive barricade, and he thought, well, how do we get through here? Because this is where we're going to lose half our men trying to get in. And he sat and thought about it. And he was intrigued by this enormous, and I'm big, enormous, knot. Entanglement, but a knot. You know what a knot is. And he was intrigued, but he insisted to the guards of the Gordian guards. He said, "Go and get your leader. I want to talk to him." So the leader came down. I'm being very brief about this. People will tell it differently. And the leader came down and said, "Oh, you're Alexander. Oh, yes, well, you're the head of the Gordians, yes. What do you want?" "I'm busy, I'm having my tea." And Alexander said, "Well, I want to take your property over. I'm going to take you." He says, "Well, many have tried, many have failed. And you know our pedigree. And to be honest, you will fail, Alexander." And Alexander said, "Well, that as may be. But it's not for the want of trying, and we will have a go." And the head of the Gordians was asked by Alexander, what's with the knot? He says, "Oh, that's a very famous knot." He says, "In fact, it is so complex that nobody in my working knowledge in lifetime has managed to figure out where the beginning is and where the end is of the knot. Nobody can undo it. In fact, Alexander, if you can undo it, I will personally surrender my fort and its men at your disposal, and you without a fight." That confident was the Gordian. And Alexander said, "Well, let me think upon this then. If that's the deal, and I can figure out a way of undoing the knot, you will surrender everything." He said, "Absolutely will." And everybody was waiting with bated breath for hours. Alexander thought about this. His men were taking a break, having a fag break, maybe. And he said, "Okay, I think I've figured out a way," he said to the Gordian. And the Gordian was, "Oh, well, do try. Many have tried and many have failed. But you agree that if you fail, you'll just disappear like a fart in the wind, or if you can undo the knot, we will surrender our property to you." Absolutely. And with that agreed and witnessed, Alexander pulled out a huge sword and whack, straight through the knot. In one foul swoop, the knot fell apart and opened. So there you are. I've opened the knot. Now, in simplistic terms, then, it defies explanation or resist. What more could the Gordian say? And the moral of that little tale, obviously, Alexander took the Gordians' goodies, and the rest is history, as they say. But that's a very simplistic little story. But it demonstrates that many people try things one way because they think that's the cure. Oh, well, the standard issue solutions just don't work, do they? And sometimes you have to take a deep breath and walk away from problems and put them on ice, if you like. Put them, just think. And the problem is with people nowadays, they just don't think. They truly don't. They want it now, they want it immediately, they want an instant answer, they want it as easy as possible. But the problem is they don't think. They think, but they don't think. And it is oh so true that we should try to think outside the box. Examine what other people have done, and, even though it'd be an obvious solution that hasn't worked, maybe think again. And Alexander was a fantastic tactician who didn't want to think like anybody else. His thinking was very unique in many ways. And that little story just demonstrates how you really have to solve an old problem, you have to use new solutions. And apply that to solving the problem. And the reason I tell you that little story, which is right for the most part, I'm sure there are people who could tell it better, with more flair, but I'm just trying to get a point over. Both the Gordian and Alexander were content with the outcome, quite frankly. Alexander more, because the Gordian was obviously pleased that half his people weren't slaughtered. And he was also, has to be a man of his word. And he was. And ultimately then the whole thing worked out to Alexander's benefit. And that was the way that worked. But the reason I mentioned that little story, and the one about the scorpion and the frog, was that we have amongst us, folks, scorpions. We truly do, and we are the frogs. And there's a couple of people in our politics in the United Kingdom that have recently come out quite well in the electoral shufflings that are going on, namely Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. Both of them seem very amicable. Boris Johnson is a little bit suspect because he's an old Etonian and he's a Bullingdon boy, very, very close and friendly, very, obviously, that close with David Cameron and Osborne, not to mention some others that are Bullingdon boys from Eton. In fact, there are photographs all over the internet about their little shenanigans and high spirits, this Bullingdon club that they belong to. And it's a little bit like the Skull and Bones Society of Yale, and we know what happens there. Well, in the case of Cameron, yes, part of the qualification to be part of the Bullingdon Boy Club is that you have to close your children's ears, you have to stick your man's parts in a pig's mouth. Even though in the case of this, apparently, it's a severed head of a pig. Yes, we'll leave it at that. Part of the Bullingdon Boy band, they will smash hotel rooms up, and they rebel rousers, rebels without a cause, these lot. And that is our Boris. Much as you might like him, there is a dark side to Boris. He is truly a scorpion, a very dangerous one. But nonetheless, he seems to be flavour of the month for replacing Theresa May. Okay. Now, the other one is Nigel Farage. Now, until recently, I had quite a bit of respect in it for Nigel Farage. But certain things come to light about Nigel Farage that are disturbing to me. Now, you'll recall that I mentioned the plottings, the internal machinations of the scorpion as he was realising the turning of the tide with the water coming his way. He had to find a way out and a way across this river before it drowned him. And before Brexit, Farage was part of the UKIP party, wasn't he? And he saw the writing on the wall that was going down the toilet for God knows whatever reason. And the Labour and the Conservatives, there was very little chance of anything from a career point of view. And all that Farage had to look forward to was another 20 years stuck as a European politician in Brussels. Not something he was rather excited about, I do believe. But then the meteoric rise after the establishment of the Brexit Party We have Nigel Farage head above everybody else in the recent elections, European elections. Well, say no more, it's a done deal, and it's ever likely that the Brexit Party will be having fantastic success in due course and will now be a dog with teeth. And what has done UKIP in, of course, is associating themselves with the British National Party young man that joins them, Tommy Robinson. So UKIP, forget it. Talk about a poison chalice they took on, and didn't they take one on? I don't think it was entirely Tommy Robinson's fault, but I think he was quite instrumental in really being the cyanide in the apple, if you get my meaning. So, just at the right time, at the lastminute.com, Brexit, meteoric success in the European elections, and has knocked Labour off the perch, and it has knocked the Conservatives off the perch. The rats are running, they really are. And there's tears all round for those losing their salaries and positions who thought they had a job for life. So we have Farage now in the wings, waiting, getting back into British politics again, smirking like a Cheshire cat. But there's something very disturbing about our Nigel Farage. Two very disturbing things. One is he is a big believer in fracking. Okay, number one. And the other thing he is truly sold on the idea of is a European army. Those two things will sink Nigel Farage. And I think those two things, fracking supporter and European army supporter, if they was that news was put on the BBC News at 6, Farage would lose huge amounts of credibility and he will be out, because there's a huge wave in the United Kingdom against fracking, which has proved to be disgraceful. Not in my backyard sort of stuff going on, where fracking, incidentally, is drilling deep, deep holes into our bedrock. Regardless of the surrounding towns and countryside, and putting water into that bedrock at such high pressure and flow rate that it creates, well, it turns dry rubble into sludge, but mixed in with that dry rubble is natural gas, and that is tapped off. But all the sludge, well, that they don't care what happens to that. It ends up going across to the local residents' properties and causing semi-earthquakes, and it's an unsettling process, and it creates floods. Who are the big profiteers? The gas company and the investors in fracking. And this is going up big time up north, of course. Well, that's fracking for you, and Farage is a big supporter of that. Now, I thought he was for the common man, Nigel Farage, for the underdogs. But it seems that fracking is done in underdog areas, like up north, lad. Yes. They wouldn't do it in Essex, you know. So that's one, Farage being a hypocrite. And number two, even more of a hypocrite, Nigel Farage is a huge supporter of the idea of us, despite the Brexit and all his overtures about leaving Brexit, leave the European bastards to themselves. Ah. Oh, but we're okay. We will commit our troops to a European army, navy and air force. Don't forget, they say European army. It is a European force. And that will be under the dictate of the Germans, without a doubt. You see, but nobody in the press has questioned Farage about his beliefs in Brexit. Sorry, his beliefs, well, yes, in Brexit, ad nauseum. But they haven't said, why do you support a European army if you are so opposed to Europe, number one. And number two is, why do you support fracking, Mr. Farage, when it goes wholly against the grain of the average Brit? Because fracking is such bad news. It's an American thing. You see, such hypocrisy. Their hypocrisy knows no bounds. This Nigel Farage smiling assassin, because he is ultimately a businessman. He must, by definition, have a business interest somewhere in the world of fracking. He's not a broke church mouse, is Nigel Farage, and nor is Boris. Boris has his own set of problems because there's close affiliation, of course, with the Bullingdon boys. There's something about Mary, about Boris. So it just goes to show, you see, they are like that, folks. They are like that because Farage is not going to suddenly announce, by the way, everybody in TV land, and Donald Trump might know this, but I'll tell him anyway, I'm a big fan of the European army. But we want out of Europe. The two don't equate. There's something not quite right. In my spider sense, see previous videos, says that something isn't right with Nigel Farage. Brexit Party. Not if the leader is convinced on one hand to say, I hate Europe and all things about it, let's pull up the drawbridge, let's get those borders and let's protect our language, borders and culture. Oh yeah, baby. But we'll commit other people's children to stay in and join the European army. To fight for what? Well, I don't want my children fighting for France and Germany, in Italy and Spain for their vested interests. Thanks very much. Our armed forces just should look after us. And we should pull up the drawbridge and we should take all our troops back out of these war zones and stick them back on terra firma in the United Kingdom, and we will build our own wall. Because we have a sea wall called the Channel, don't we? Between us and Europe. And we've smashed them twice before, we will smash them again. With or without their bloody army. Because we already have a European army opponent. It's called NATO. Component. Why the need for a European army if we have NATO? Why don't they just make NATO that little bit bigger? Because NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but hey, it's totally operating outside its remit. Right as we speak. What's half the fleet doing in the coast of Syria then, and Iran? On the straits? Yeah? Well, we're just in such a mess, aren't we? It's ever likely we are controlled by those scorpions who don't have any allegiance. They only tell us, folks, what we want to hear and not what is the truth. How bad is that? So before you go rushing off, thinking how wonderful Nigel Farage is, or rushing off and voting for Boris Johnson, well, think once, think twice, and then don't vote. Because do you know what? What will happen, with or without your vote. Trust me on this. It really doesn't matter, because you know and I know that the next 50-year agenda is already set in stone. And so it is written, so it'll be done, because the Bilderberg group rule okay. Because our politicians and our businessmen in our world are called in once a year to the Bilderberg group, and given their directive from the half percenters, not the 1%ers, the ultra, ultra, ultra wealthy. Our business leaders are dictated to by the Bilderberg Group, that nobody knows exists, by the way. Ha ha ha. And that's what's going to happen. And we delude ourselves that we have such a fighting choice to cast a vote. Well, I don't vote. But equally, I don't moan about the outcome. I'm conscious of the outcome and the potential effects upon my life, of course. And I do prep to some degree. But nothing I can do, and nothing you can do, quite frankly. The moving finger having writ moves on, and all thy piety and wit will not remove a word of it. Think about that. Well, it's time that we move on and stop fretting over such nonsense. Because when we got scorpions as leaders, we haven't got a prayer anyway.